Dear students, this is The History and Culture of the Indian People, published by Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, Mumbai. Chief Editor, Professor R. C. Majumdar. Volume 1, The Vedic Age. Forward, by Dr. K. M. Munshi.
In the course of my studies, I had long felt the inadequacy of our so-called Indian histories. For many years, therefore, I was planning an elaborate history of India in order not only that India's past might be described by her sons, but also that the world might catch a glimpse of her soul as Indians see it. The Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, an educational society which I founded in 1938, took over the scheme. It was, however, realized only in 1944 when my generous friend Mr. G. D. Birla, one of India's foremost industrialists, lent me his cooperation and the support of the Sri Krishnarpan Charity Trust, of which he is the chairman. As a result, the Bharatiya Itihasa Samiti, the Academy of Indian History, was formed with the specific object of preparing this series, now styled The History and Culture of the Indian People. The Samiti was lucky in securing the services of Dr. R. C. Majumdar, formerly Vice-Chancellor of Dhaka University and one of India's leading historians, as full-time editor, and of Dr. A. D. Pusalka, a young and promising scholar, Assistant Director of the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, as Assistant Editor. A large number of Indian scholars of repute have lent their cooperation to the scheme. Professor H. G. Rawlinson has been good enough to undertake the task of revising the manuscript. Messrs. George Allen and Unwin Litted rendered my work easy by undertaking its first publication in 1951, despite difficult publishing conditions in England, and have now been good enough to remit the publication rights to the Bhavan. To all of them, I owe a deep debt of gratitude, which I hasten to acknowledge. The general editor in his introduction has given the point of view of the scientific historian, to which category the contributors belong. My own work for the past 35 years has lain in the humbler sphere of weaving historical romances and literary and cultural studies out of materials so heroically salvaged by Indian and European scholars. As a result, I have seen and felt the form, continuity, and meaning of India's past. History, as I see it, is being consciously lived by Indians. Attempts to complete what has happened in the past form no small part of our modern struggle. There is a conscious as well as an unconscious attempt to carry life to perfection, to join the fragments of existence, and to discover the meaning of the visions which they reveal. It is not enough, therefore, to conserve, record, and understand what has happened. It is necessary also to assess the nature and direction of the momentous forces working through the life of India in order to appreciate the fulfillment which they seek. Some years ago, therefore, I defined the scope of history as follows. To be a history in the true sense of the word, the work must be the story of the people inhabiting a country. It must be a record of their life from age to age, presented through the life and achievements of men whose exploits become the beacon lights of tradition, through the characteristic reaction of the people to physical and economic conditions, through political changes and vicissitudes which create the forces and conditions which operate upon life, through characteristic social institutions, beliefs and forms, through literary and artistic achievements, through the movements of thought which from time to time helped or hindered the growth of collective harmony, through those values which the people have accepted or reacted to and which created or shaped their collective will, through efforts of the people to will themselves into an organic unity. The central purpose of a history must, therefore, be to investigate and unfold the values which age after age have inspired the inhabitants of a country to develop their collective will and to express it through the manifold activities of their life. Such a history of India is still to be written. I know the difficulties which beset the path of any enterprise which seeks to write such a history. In the past, Indians laid little store by history. Our available sources of information are inadequate, and insofar as they are foreign, are almost invariably tainted with a bias towards India's conquerors. Research is meager and disconnected. Itihasa, or legends of the gods, and Purana, legends of origin, had different spheres in the ancient literary tradition of India. But later, both came to mean the same thing: traditional history. The Kali Yuga, the current Iron Age, was considered too degenerate a period to deserve recording. The past was only cherished as the pattern for the present and the future. Works by ancient Indian authors which throw light on history are few. Religious and literary sources like the Puranas and the Kavyas have not yet fully yielded up their chronological or historical wealth. Epigraphic records, though valuable, leave many periods unrelated. Foreign travelers from other countries of Asia and from Europe, like Megasthenes of Greece, Huan Tsang of China, Al-Masudi of Arabia, Manucci of Venice, and Bernier from France, have left valuable glimpses of India, but they are the results of superficial observation, though their value in reconstructing the past is immense. Chroniclers in the courts of the Turk, Afghan, or the Mughal rulers wrote histories which, in spite of the wealth of historical material, are partially legendary and partially laudatory. The attempts of British scholars, with the exception of Todd, wherever they have taken these histories as reliable seminal source books, have hindered rather than helped the study of Indian history. Sir H. M. Eliot, the foremost of such scholars, for instance, has translated extracts from Persian and Arabic histories with a political objective, viz. To make, to use his own words, the native subjects of British India more sensible of the immense advantages accruing to them under the mildness and equity of the present rule. So high an authority as Dr. Maulana Nadvi, in his presidential address at the early medieval India section of the 7th session of the Indian History Congress, expressed the verdict of modern scholars that both the selection and translation of these extracts have not been honest. But unfortunately, Eliot's volumes became the source book for most of our modern histories of medieval India. As a result, they do not present a true picture of India's past, nor do they explain how Indians resisted the Turk, Afghan, and Mughal incursions, how they reacted to the vicissitudes through which, in consequence, they passed, and how a renaissance sprang up out of the impact of Indian with Persian and Turkish cultures. The treatment of the British period in most of our histories is equally defective. It generally reads like an unofficial report of the British conquest and of the benefits derived by India from it. It does not give us the real India, nor does it present a picture of what we saw, felt, and suffered, of how we reacted to foreign influences, or of the values and organizations we created out of the impact with the West. The history of India, as dealt with in most of the works of this kind, naturally, therefore, lacks historical perspective. Unfortunately for us, during the last 200 years, we had not only to study such histories but unconsciously to mold our whole outlook on life upon them. Few people realize that the teaching of such histories in our schools and universities has substantially added to the difficulties which India has had to face during the last 100 years, and never more than during recent years. Generation after generation during their school or college career were told about the successive foreign invasions of the country, but little about how we resisted them and less about our victories. They were taught to decry the Hindu social system, but they were not told how this system came into existence as a synthesis of political, social, economic, and cultural forces, how it developed in the people the tenacity to survive catastrophic changes for millennia, how it protected life and culture in times of difficulty by its conservative strength, and in favorable times developed an elasticity which made ordered progress possible, and how its vitality enabled the national culture to adjust its central ideas to new conditions. Readers were regaled with Alexander's short lived and unfruitious invasion of India. They were left in ignorance of the magnificent empire and still more enduring culture which the Gangetic Valley had built up at the time. Lurid details of intrigues in the palaces of the sultans of Delhi, often a camp of bloodthirsty invaders, are given, but little light is thrown on the exploits of the race of heroes and heroines who for centuries resisted the Central Asiatic barbarians when they flung themselves on this land in successive waves. Gruesome stories of Muslim atrocities are narrated, but the harmony which was evolved in social and economic life between the two communities remains unnoticed. The Mutiny of 1857, the British name for the Great National Revolt, gave the readers a glimpse of how the brave foreigner crushed India. It is only outside the so-called historical studies that the reader found how at the time patriotic men of all communities in most parts of India rallied round the last Mughal emperor of Delhi, the national symbol, to drive out the hated foreigner. The multiplicity of our languages and communities is widely advertised, but little emphasis is laid on certain facts which make India what she is. Throughout the last 2 millennia, there was linguistic unity. Some sort of a lingua franca was used by a very large part of the country. And Sanskrit, for 1,000 years, the language of royal courts and at all times the language of culture was predominant, influencing life, language, and literature in most provinces. For over 3,000 years, social and family life had been molded or influenced by the Dharma Sastra texts, containing a comprehensive code of personal law, which, though adapted from time to suit every age and province, provided a continuous unifying social force. Aryan, or rather Hindu culture, for there was considerable Dravidian influence, drew its inspiration in every successive generation from Sanskrit works on religion, philosophy, ritual, law, and science, and particularly the two epics, the Mahabharata and Ramayana, and the Bhagavata, underwent recensions from time to time and became the one irresistible creative force which has shaped the collective spirit of the people. Age after age, the best of Indians, from the mythical Vasishtha to the modern Gandhiji, found self-fulfillment in living up to an ideal of conduct in accordance with a code of life which may be traced back as far as the Upanishads. The British conquest and the benefits of British rule are generally described in histories in Rudyard Kipling style. The impact of Western culture, however, came in the wake of the British connection. In our histories, we completely lose sight of how this impact awoke the sleeping giant to a consciousness of its ancient strength and modern possibilities. How, under the influence of European ideas and British democratic traditions, the collective spirit, without losing its grip over the essentials of its culture, adjusted itself to modern conditions, creating new intellectual and artistic movements and making the democratic traditions of Great Britain its own. How, under the European concept of nationalism, Arya Dharma, Indian culture, slowly broadened out into a powerful neo-nationalism seeking a secular democratic state, Indian in conception and technique. The older school of historians believed that imperialism of the militaristic political type was unfamiliar to this mystic land. But the Aryan conquest of India, which forms the subject matter of volley of this series, was as much militaristic political as religious and cultural. If instead of treating by dynasties, stress is laid on the rise and fall of imperial power, Magadhan sovereignty and Satavahana imperialism from 600 BC to AD 320 Vol. 2 were, for the age, outstanding phenomena. If the territory involved, the population affected, and the heroism and power of organization displayed and the cultural activities pursued are taken into account, the classical age, AD 320 to 750, which saw the empire of the Guptas and of Sri Harsha, was one of the culminating points in history. The age between AD 750 1000 saw the empire of the Pratiharas, the Rashtrakutas, and the Palas. Between AD 1000 and 1300, the Paramaras and the Cholas founded empires. Different states struggled for imperial power. The barbarian inroads from Central Asia rendered all indigenous efforts at consolidation unfruitful. The rise of the Turkish power under Ala ud-Din Khilji founded a new and powerful imperialism, the Sultanate of Delhi, which lasted from 1300 to 1526. From AD 1526 to 1707, the Mughals held sway at Delhi when the world witnessed one of the most magnificent empires of all time. The Maratha supremacy, which lasted from 1707 to 1818, brought about the downfall of the Mughal Empire. But before it could consolidate its power, the British stepped in. British domination from 1818-1947 was a period of complete subjection. But it saw the national resurgence which, on August 15, 1947, under Mahatma Gandhi, secured freedom by non-violent means. It also saw the birth of a renaissance which gave fresh vitality to all that India stood for in history. These militaristic political movements in India were in no wise less vigorous or worldly than similar movements in other parts of the world in the corresponding age. To say that the country was lost in contemplation all the time would be to ignore the salient facts of history. The role of alien invasions in the history of India, hitherto exaggerated, deserves to be reduced to its appropriate proportions. India, like most other countries, has had its foreign incursions, which, like Mahmud of Ghazni's raids between AD 999 and 1084, glittering episodes from the raider's point of view were at best only shaping influences. Of foreign conquests, which changed the course of history and the texture of life and culture, there were only three. First, the Aryan conquests in prehistoric times, which wove the essential pattern of national life and culture. Second, the Turco-Afghan conquests, which introduced Islamic influence into India and added new colors to the pattern of life. These conquests, however, soon lost their character of foreign military occupation, for the conquerors threw in their lot with the country and produced some of its best rulers and its most powerful political organizations. This so-called Muslim period, scientifically the Turco-Mughal period, dominated the country for about 4 centuries, roughly from AD 1300 to 1700. Third, the British occupation from 1818 to 1947, perhaps the only period of foreign rule in the sense that the country was governed essentially by foreigners from a foreign country and in foreign interests. It brought in its wake contact with Europe, a new awakening, and a new cultural synthesis. But during all this period, the vitality of the race and culture, altered from time to time in direction and objective, expressed itself with unabated vigor in resistance movements. Military, political, and cultural, the history of India is not the story of how she underwent foreign invasions, but how she resisted them and eventually triumphed over them. Traditions of modern historical research founded by British scholars of repute were unfortunately colored by their attitude towards ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome, which have a dead past and are, in a sense, museum exhibits. A post-mortem examination of Indian past would be scientifically inaccurate, for every period of Indian history is no more than an expression in a limited period of all the life forces and dominant ideas created and preserved by the national culture, which are rushing forward at every moment through time. The modern historian of India must approach her as a living entity with a central continuous urge, of which the apparent life is a mere expression. Without such an outlook, it is impossible to understand India, which, though a part of it has seceded in search of an independent existence, stands today 350 million strong. with a new apparatus of state, determined not to be untrue to its ancient self, and yet to be equal to the highest demands of modern life. Preface by R.C. Majumdar. The genesis of this work and its scope and nature have been explained in the foreword, but it is necessary to add a few words about its general planning. After having decided that the work would consist of 10 volumes of approximately 500 pages each, it was not an easy task to distribute the subject matter among them on a basis which would be both equitable and rational. It has been hitherto customary to divide Indian history into the Hindu, Muslim, and British periods and assign equal space to each. The Cambridge History of India has set its seal of approval upon this plan, which has also been adopted by the Indian History Congress for its projected history of India. But it can hardly be regarded as equitable. Looking at the matter from a broad standpoint, it would be difficult to maintain that the 4,000 years of pre-Muslim India, of the history and culture of which we possess a definite knowledge, though in brief outline, should rank in importance as equal with that of the Muslim period of about 400 or 500 years, or the British period of less than 200 years. It is true that we possess more historical material for the later ages, but if we are to judge by that standard alone, the British period should have twice or thrice the number of volumes assigned to the Muslim period. After all, the contribution of different ages to the evolution of national history and culture should be the main criterion of their relative importance, though the space devoted to each should also be largely determined by the amount of historical material available. There is, no doubt, a dearth of material for the political history of ancient India, but this is, to a large extent, made up for by the corresponding abundance for the cultural side. Taking everything into consideration, we have modified the hitherto accepted plan and have allotted nearly half of the entire work to the Hindu period. Some difference will also be noticed in our conception of the beginning and end of the Muslim period. It is usual to regard the accession of Qutb-ud-Din to the throne of Delhi as the commencement of this period, and some historians even include within it the period of Ghaznivite supremacy in the Punjab 2 centuries earlier. It should be remembered, however, that the major part of India remained under Hindu rule almost throughout the 13th century AD, and the same was also largely true of the century following the death of Aurangzeb. To include these 2 centuries under the Muslim period can therefore be hardly regarded as historically accurate. These difficulties can best be overcome by avoiding altogether the terms Hindu and Muslim. As a matter of fact, one may rightly question the reasonableness of designating historical periods by the religious denomination of the ruling dynasties. In that case, in order to be consistent, we should style the third period of Indian history Christian rather than British. This is sufficient to demonstrate the absurdity of the present system of nomenclature, deep-rooted though it has become. We have accordingly divided Indian history into 3 chronological periods: ancient, medieval, and modern, which are generally adopted for the history of Europe. In the case of Europe, the overthrow of the Western Roman Empire by the eruption of barbarian hordes, which brought about the disappearance of classical learning, is taken to be the dividing line between ancient and medieval periods. In the case of India, there is no general agreement on this subject, but the onslaught of Islam, accompanied by a marked decadence of culture and the disappearance of the creative spirit in art and literature, seems to mark AD 1000 as the beginning of the medieval age. The decline of the Mughal Empire and the growing power of the European nations in Indian politics may be reasonably regarded as marking the end of one and the beginning of another epoch in Indian history. And hence, the 18th century has been taken as the commencement of the modern period. In Europe, the modern period dates from the overthrow of the Eastern Roman Empire and the subversion of the age of faith and tradition by the awakening of humanism through the agency of the revival of classical learning. On this analogy, one might be inclined to include the 18th century within the medieval rather than the modern period. But the political considerations referred to above, especially the establishment of the British power on a solid basis, are strong arguments in favor of dating the beginning of the modern period from the 18th century rather than the 19th. For reasons given above, neither the 13th nor the 18th century AD has been included within what is usually described as the Muslim period. The first is taken as a part of a long period of protracted struggle for political supremacy, both between the Indians and foreign invaders, and among the Indians themselves, which ultimately ended in the next century in favor of the Khiljis. So far as the 18th century is concerned, there is no doubt that the Marathas were the leading political power in India. These two volumes have been styled accordingly. So far, by way of explanation of the general division into three broad periods: ancient, medieval, and modern, and the titles given to volumes Fiv and Void, which mark a great departure from current practice. It must be remembered, however, that while specific dates had to be assigned to each volume for the sake of precision and accuracy, they should not be strictly equated with the title given to it. The period of Maratha supremacy, for example, cannot be said to cover exactly the years AD 1707 to 1818. But nevertheless, these have been taken to be the limiting dates of Volume 8, which bears that title, because they mark definite events of great importance connected with the central theme, viz., the death of Aurangzeb, which facilitated the growth of Maratha power, and the Third Maratha War, which put an end to the Maratha supremacy. The same is more or less true of the other volumes, and the justification for the titles and dates will be discussed in the preface of each. For the present, we may confine our attention to the present volume. Although it is entitled The Vedic Age, it begins from the dawn of human activity in India, so far as it is known to us. Being the first volume of the series, it contains an introductory section dealing with certain general topics bearing upon the history of India as a whole. As there are some special characteristics which distinguish Indian history from that of other countries, it has been thought desirable to explain at the very outset its meaning and methods of approach, as well as the nature of the material from which it has been reconstructed. The first three chapters have been devoted to this subject. The next three deal with the background of Indian history, geological, geographical, and biological. These chapters, particularly the first and third, may appear too technical for the historical student, and some may even regard them as too elaborate for a treatise on history at all. But a knowledge of these topics is essential for a proper understanding of the evolution of Indian culture, and being written by acknowledged experts, these two chapters, it may be hoped, will place at the disposal of the reader adequate information on difficult but relevant subjects, which it would not be possible for them to acquire except by the patient study of bulky volumes of a highly technical nature, which few would be disposed to undertake. The next section, which may be regarded as the beginning of history proper, deals with the period before the Vedic Aryans settled in this country. This, however, involves certain assumptions which are not unanimously accepted. Some scholars hold the view that India was the original home of these Aryans, and that there cannot be any question of their immigration into this country. Some have referred the Aryans to such hoary antiquity, tens of thousands of years ago, according to more than one theory, that there can be no question of any historical period prior to them. Similarly, there is a divergence of opinion regarding the question whether the Indus Valley civilization was pre-Aryan or post-Vedic. In the present state of our knowledge, no dogmatic answer can be given to these questions, and there is no theory that is likely to meet with general acceptance. Even our own contributors do not agree on these points. Dr. Pusalkar, who has written on the Indus Valley civilization, is inclined to regard it as not fundamentally different from the Aryan and possibly posterior to Rigvedic culture, while the B.K. Ghosh and Dr. S.T.K. Chatterjee, who have written on the Aryan and pre-Aryan peoples, take the opposite view. Such differences are inevitable in a cooperative undertaking of this kind. It has not been thought advisable to suppress these individual viewpoints, but cross references have been given in order to impress upon the readers that such questions do admit of different answers and to enable them to judge for themselves the cogency of the arguments on which different theories are based. It has been the constant attempt of the editor, by free and frank discussions, to reconcile the different points of view as far as practicable, and where complete agreement was unattainable, to have them presented in a manner which would convey the impression that they are not dogmatic assertions of contradictory views, but alternative solutions, each equally valid, of the problem concerned. Beyond that, the editor did not choose to go, by way of forcing a definite solution of an admittedly controversial problem. It has been thought better to risk even a seeming inconsistency among the different parts of the book, rather than convey a false idea of a general agreement of views where no such unanimity really exists or is possible under the present circumstances. The third section is devoted to a general consideration of the Indo-Aryans. It begins with a detailed discussion of the chief problems concerning them, viz. Their original home, the date and route of their immigration into India, the antiquity of their chief literary production, the Rigveda, and their relations with the Iranians, with whom they must have lived in close and intimate contact long after their separation from the other branches of the Indo-European family. These are some of the most intriguing problems on which opinions differ widely, and an attempt has been made to present the different viewpoints, with emphasis on the one which appears to be most reasonable in the light of the evidence available to us. Although few scholars today believe India to be the original home of the Aryans, this theory has naturally a sentimental appeal to Indians and has therefore been discussed in some detail in an appendix to Chapter 10. The fourth section deals with the political history of the period. It has been customary hitherto to rely for such knowledge only on the few scattered historical notices contained in the Rigveda. Pargeter's attempt to reconstruct a continuous historical narrative from the data, particularly the royal genealogies, contained in the Puranas and the epics, has been systematically ignored in historical works, even in the comprehensive Cambridge History of India. But, in spite of obvious shortcomings, Pargeter's theories cannot be altogether discarded even on their merits, and the fact remains that they offer the only fair basis on which the ancient political history of India can be built up. So, instead of being content to glean a few isolated facts from the Rigveda, as has hitherto been done, we have tried to trace a brief outline of the traditional history of early India on the lines laid down by Pargeter. This must not, of course, be confused with history proper, but it possesses none the less great value of its own, both as a tangible framework for connecting a number of well-authenticated facts and as a basis for further investigation of our historical knowledge of this obscure period. Pargeter has at least successfully demonstrated that it is a mistake to regard such great historical figures of antiquity as Puru, Mandata, Nahusha, Yayati, Kartavirya, Arjuna, etc., as mere fanciful and mythological names, and any theory which gives them some sort of historical setting cannot but be regarded as of great value to students of Indian history. In spite of the limitations of our knowledge of the political history of the period, there can be no doubt that its chief interest and importance lie in the picture of culture and civilization offered by the vast field of Vedic literature. Whereas everything else is but vaguely known, we possess nearly full information about the growth and gradual evolution of the Indian civilization from the well-marked stratification of the mass of literature, collectively known as the Vedas. It is also a matter of general knowledge that this civilization is the common basis on which succeeding generations of diverse races and localities have built up the imposing structure known as the Hindu civilization. This would explain why this volume has been entitled The Vedic Age, and detailed study has been made of it in three different sections, corresponding to the three well-marked stages of the evolution of Vedic literature. There is a general agreement among scholars about the chronological sequence of Vedic literature. The Rig Samhita, representing the earliest stage, the other Samhitas and Brahmanas the next, and the Upanishads and Sutras the concluding one. But while these chronological divisions are broadly speaking accurate, it is to be noted that they are to some extent overlapping, and it is difficult to draw an absolutely rigid line of demarcation between them. It is likely, for example, that some portions of the Atharva Samhita are as old as, if not older than, portions of the Rig Samhita, and some of the oldest Upanishads certainly reach back to the Brahmana period. Nevertheless, the general outlook of the three different categories of literature is sufficiently distinct to label them as belonging to three successive chronological periods, and they have been dealt with accordingly in three separate sections. It is, however, a difficult problem to assign definite dates to the three literary stages of the Vedic period. In spite of extravagant theories about the antiquity of the Rig Samhita, the view that it received its present form about 1000 BC has much to commend itself. Though mainly based on philological grounds, as enunciated in Chapter 12, this theory finds unexpected support even from Indian traditions. For some of the kings referred to in the Rig Samhita seem to be identical with those mentioned in the royal genealogies and occupying a low place in the dynastic list. Further, as Pargeter has pointed out, the epic and Puranic tradition unanimously and repeatedly declares that the Veda was arranged by Vyasa, who flourished about the time of the Bharata War, which has been dated between 1500 and 1000 BC by many scholars. Whatever we might think of this date, it is important to remember that along with the doctrine that the Veda is eternal and everlasting, there are also ancient traditions to the effect that it was compiled by Vyasa not long before the great Bharata War. The view that dates the Rig Samhita in its present form to about 1000 BC cannot therefore be regarded as absolutely wide of the mark and altogether without any basis of support in Indian tradition. But it must be remembered that although the Rig Samhita might have received its final shape in about 1000 BC, some of its contents are much older and go back certainly to 1500 BC and not improbably even to a much earlier date. There is no doubt whatsoever that the oldest Upanishads are pre-Buddhist, and some of them, at any rate, belong to the 7th century BC, if not earlier. Still, the later Samhitas and Brahmanas accordingly may be placed, generally speaking, in the 9th and 8th centuries BC. These dates are, of course, only provisional and are set down here as merely working hypotheses. No precise date can be assigned to the end of the Vedic age, for the Sutras and Upanishads, representing the last stage of Vedic literature, contain texts of varying antiquity. While, as mentioned above, some of them are probably as old as the 7th century BC, if not older still, others are probably as late as the 3rd or 4th century BC. Although, therefore, the Vedic age cannot be regarded, strictly speaking, as having come to an end in 600 BC, with which this volume closes, this date has been selected mainly for two reasons. In the first place, the 6th century BC saw the rise of Buddhism, Jainism, and other religious sects, heralding that Protestant movement which was destined to bring to an end the unquestioned supremacy of Vedic religion and culture. Secondly, our knowledge of political history becomes more precise and definite from the 6th century BC, and we can clearly perceive how the stage was gradually set for the rise of the great Magadha Empire, which constitutes the most distinguishing feature of the succeeding period. Although the age of the Sutras and Upanishads extends beyond 600 BC, culturally, it is a direct offshoot and a continuation of the earlier Vedic civilization, and reflects no special characteristic of the later era, such as we find in the epics, Puranas, or Buddhist and Jaina literature. It has therefore been included in the volume dealing with the Vedic age even in disregard of the strict limitations of chronology. This volume attempts a picture of what may be regarded as the dawn of Hindu civilization. To continue this metaphor, we may say that the next two volumes reflect its full morning glory and noonday splendor. In the fourth volume, we come across the shadows of the declining day, while dusk sets in with the fifth. Then follows the darkness of the long night, so far as Hindu civilization is concerned, a darkness which envelops it even now. This gives a broad idea of the distribution of the first 5 volumes of this series. The editor takes this opportunity of offering his sincere thanks to the contributors of this volume for their hearty cooperation, and to Professor H.G. Rawlinson for having kindly revised the manuscript. He notes with great regret that one of the contributors, Rao Bahadur K. N. Dikshit, late Director General of Archaeology, Government of India, passed away while the book was in the press, and takes this opportunity to convey his condolence to the bereaved family. His death has been a serious loss to Indian archaeology. The Department of Archaeology, Government of India, has kindly supplied us with photographs for which we express our hearty thanks to the authorities. Some amount of repetition or overlapping is inevitable in a book of this kind, where different authors deal with literature and the philosophical, religious, and social ideas mainly derived from it, and where the different chapters are closely related to one another. The system of transliteration adopted in this volume is that followed in the Epigraphia Indica. The geographical names have been spelled as in the Imperial Gazetteer, with a few exceptions such as Krishna for Kisna, Narmada for Narbada. Diacritical marks have not been used as a rule in geographical names and Oriental words with an English suffix, Puranic, Rigvedic, Brahmanical, etc., except to indicate the longer sound A. In the word Aryan, however, the A has not been lengthened, as it may now be regarded as almost a naturalized English word. In addition to footnotes, general references have been added at the beginning of some chapters in order to vindicate books or articles in periodicals which have been extensively used or frequently referred to in the body of the text. No footnotes have been given in Chapter 2, as all the works cited therein will be dealt with in detail in subsequent chapters. A bibliography has been added for the convenience of those readers who wish to make special studies of any particular topic. As most of our knowledge regarding the history and culture of the Vedic age is derived from Vedic literature, and a large number of secondary texts also deal with the period as a whole, a general bibliography has been given at the end which covers the topics dealt with in books 4, V, 6, and 7. Generally speaking, the bibliography is selective in character and does not aim at giving an exhaustive list of works on the subject. The only exception to this is the bibliography to Chapter 9, where an attempt has been made to give a list of all important contributions on the Indus Valley civilization, as the subject is comparatively new and controversial in character, and it is difficult to assess the proper value of the different theories. As copious footnotes have been given in many chapters, important references indicated therein have not been included.
Dear students, thank you for listening. This was the foreword and preface of book, The History and Culture of Indian People, published by Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan. General Editor, Professor R.C. Majumdar, Volume 1, The Vedic Age. In the next episode in Chapter 1, Indian History, its scope and method. Let's meet in the next chapter. Goodbye.